A bunch of you have asked me in recent weeks if I think it's safe to travel to Paris and to travel to other areas of France right now for vacation, given that coronavirus is still alive and well. So I wanted to make a short video, no fancy edits. I'm just gonna answer that question, get this video right up in case it can help you make a decision one way or another. And I know this question has been on so many of your minds, so let me get right into it. Just to start, if you've been to France in the past year and a half, or you've watched the news, or you've read my blog, you know life here, like many other places right now, it's been far from normal. From lockdowns to quarantines to closed borders and restrictions, and now to digital health passes. Life in France as we know it was more like a dystopian novel and not a reality. But the reality is that coronavirus is not yet a thing of the past. So is it safe to travel to France right now? So many of you want to know what I think. So let me start out by saying I do not have all the answers. My opinion is my opinion. And while I can share what life is like right now here in France, along with some questions for you to think about that might guide you in your decision, the decision to travel to France is yours, and you have to make the best choice for your personal circumstances. Also, I just want to point out what I'm going to talk about here. It's for people wondering if traveling to France right now for vacation is a good idea, for non-essential tourism travel. Obviously, for urgent family matters, medical reasons, things like that, not tourism. I think the answer can be a bit more clear-cut because sometimes an urgent situation will always take precedence over all else, which was the case when I went to the US a couple of months ago. It was not tourism. And something I'll say right out of the gate is I also think that just because you now can legally travel to France, it doesn't necessarily mean you should, but we're gonna get into that. A lot, as I said, depends on your personal situation, and I absolutely see both sides of the argument. And people have really strong opinions on both sides of this argument. You know, there's one side that says, don't travel anywhere now for tourism. If it's not essential, stay home. Don't go anywhere ever under all circumstances. It's not okay to travel internationally right now. That way, we're at much less risk of catching COVID, spreading it to others. And then there's the other perspective that says, well, if we travel as safely as possible and we do our best to reduce our risk and reduce that transmission to those around us, isn't it time to get on with our lives? So I see it both ways. I hear you, I feel you, and and then in between those two perspectives, there's everything else, right? And as I said, and I just want to stress this, only you can make your final decision, right? But do consider what I talk about here. I do think there are ways to travel relatively safely in France and reduce your risk of catching and spreading the virus, but it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all answer. So for healthy, vaccinated travelers who aren't traveling in large groups, I do feel that Paris and most areas of France are safe-ish for tourists, but let's just start with the current situation in France in case you're not aware. Fully vaccinated travelers are allowed to enter France, and there are no restrictions on movement within France. So you can rent a car, go to the coast, go to the city, it's open. Fully vaccinated means you'll need to have had 2 doses of one of the EU-approved vaccines, so that's Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, and you'll need your second dose of the ones that are 2-dose vaccines at least 2 weeks prior to travel. Now, if you're not vaccinated and you're from a green country, which includes the US and Canada, you need to have a negative COVID test that's done, I believe it's a PCR test, taken within 72 hours of departure. And I'm going to put full details and other further country-specific information down below in the description so you can get the most up-to-date info. Now, on top of that, there are about 20,000 new cases of the virus per day in France. Those stats are from the World Health Organization. And now we have a digital health pass called a pass sanitaire, and that is required to go to places like restaurants, concerts, movies, on trains and other modes of public transport, festivals, museums, and even for the hospital for non-emergencies. So this has been the case since the beginning of the month, I believe August 9th. And again, I'll put instructions for getting your health pass down below so you can get that app if you do plan to travel to France, so you'll be set. Something else you might not be aware of, masks are required in public indoor spaces, including public transportation, pretty much everywhere, and even outdoors in some places, as was the case this weekend when we were in Brittany, in Saint-Malo, in Vannes, and you do have to wear a mask over your face. Even outdoors. And this is common in historical centers and places where there's a high density of people. Now, were people in compliance? I would say half of the people were, and it wasn't being enforced. So just pointing that out. Something else I want to point out, the US State Department's website has a France travel advisory. It's from August 9th, and it says level 4, do not travel. That is the highest level. So I just want to make you aware. It does read, quote, do not travel to France due to COVID-19. Exercise increased caution in France due to terrorism and civil unrest, ... It also goes on to say, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, has issued a level 4 travel health notice for France due to COVID, indicating a really high level of COVID-19 in the country. Your risk of contracting COVID-19 and developing severe symptoms may be lower if you are fully vaccinated. So it talks about COVID, it mentions civil unrest and terrorism. I'm just putting it out there. Right now, personally, do I feel unsafe in France? No. I'm also not in a big city. I actually felt more unsafe back in the US in the state of Florida a couple of months ago. Is it a war zone here? No. Is there civil unrest everywhere? No. Is everyone dropping dead of COVID? No. But it is a warning, and there are protests. There is a lot of COVID. But we can try to be safe and avoid areas where civil unrest has been reported. I think the riskiest part of the trip is the airport and the plane ride, especially if once you're in France, you're just traveling alone, or in a city, you're outdoors, you're in open air. And life almost feels back to normal here, at least compared to what it was, right? You see people, they're out enjoying life again. But is the risk still there? Is the virus still here? Absolutely. Is it something that should deter you from traveling? Only you can make that decision. Before traveling to France, these are some questions that I'd ask myself that might sway you one way or the other. So consider this. Are you traveling solo or just one or two others? Or will you be in a big group tour? Are you traveling around France by a rental car? Or are you going to be in modes of public transportation where there are a lot of people? Will you be spending most of your time outdoors or in places with very few people? Or are you maybe coming for a big indoor wedding or some other event indoors? Next up, maybe one of the most important is, are you vaccinated? And what about the others in your group? Do you live with someone who's immunocompromised or elderly? Or are you yourself immunocompromised or elderly? Another one, really important, could you easily postpone your trip until next year instead? Or is it now or never due to maybe a terminal illness or something of that nature? Are you able to buy travel insurance? Is that in your budget? And if you aren't and you have to cancel your trip or it gets canceled, will losing money on that trip be a major stressor for you and your finances? Do you hate wearing a mask? France requires them indoors pretty much everywhere, and even outdoors, as I mentioned, in some areas. Also, what's your comfort level with risk, uncertainty, and rules? Are you okay with the risk being there of catching the virus, the uncertainty of changing rules, getting a health pass, getting a COVID test, and this sort of thing? Also, do you speak enough French to understand what's going on around you, to understand warnings, to know if there's a protest, if there's civil unrest, if a situation arises? Do you feel confident enough in your French abilities to understand and be understood if something comes up? Next, I completely understand wanting to travel to France and being on the fence about it. I know so many of you out there have postponed your trip. You've been really disappointed. Others have decided to go ahead and travel as safely as possible. It's not an easy decision, especially if we live with someone who is immunocompromised or elderly back at home, and just a whole host of other reasons. It's not a cut and dry decision. I would say if you do decide to travel to France now, make sure you're vaccinated. I'd also recommend that you get yourself up to date on the most current set of rules and restrictions, not only from your airline before you travel, but also the French government. Be up to date with what the CDC recommends, and then make the decision that's going to work for you. Then once you're in France, of course, it goes without saying, abide by the rules that are in place here. We're guests in France, so abide by what the French government is putting out for us to do. And for Americans in many other countries, upon returning home, I don't believe there's a quarantine either. So you won't encounter that upon going back to the US. And I do think there is one bright side. If you are able to visit and you decide it's what you want to go ahead and do, there are fewer tourists in France, especially around major tourist attractions. They're just not quite as busy with foreign tourists. So that could be a plus if you're not into crowds, especially during the times of COVID. Also, small businesses and shops are really happy to see tourists, and you'd be helping the local economy by supporting them after what's been a devastating year and a half. So what would I personally do? Again, this is just my opinion. Is Paris safe to visit right now? You know what? If I lived in the US and I was healthy, if I was fully vaccinated, if I was traveling in a small group, ready to follow the rules of the airline and those set out by the government, I would book my trip to France. I would go ahead and do it if it was something I could not easily postpone. So that's just what I wanted to talk to you quickly about today. This information, again, is up to date to the best of my knowledge as of August 28th. I really appreciate you watching. I hope I've given you maybe a little bit of clarity or something to think about. I'll see you back here on We in France soon with a new video. And please, if you're going to leave hateful, critical, nasty comments toward me or another commenter, just save your breath. I don't tolerate that BS here. We could still disagree and we could still speak respectfully. So I'm just putting that out there. If you feel compelled to be a keyboard warrior and not be kind, we can still talk about things even if we don't agree. All right. So I hope that was helpful. See you back here soon, like I said, and salut. Thank you.